In the medieval world, when the sun dipped beneath the horizon and frost crept through timber walls and earthen floors, the simple act of sleeping became a nightly battle against the cold. There were no radiators humming in the corners, no thick mattresses layered with fleece, and no snug duvets stitched in modern factories. For most people, rest was not a comfort, it was survival. In the coldest months, the absence of modern heating turned each evening into a test of endurance. The walls of cottages breathed ice, and the floors seemed to pull warmth from the body like a silent thief. In those conditions, closing one's eyes wasn't a retreat into dreams, but a fragile attempt to preserve life. Children huddled beside elderly grandparents, mothers wrapped infants in layers of coarse linen, and fathers pressed their backs to the fire's last embers, hoping for enough heat to last till morning. The idea of a bed, as we know it today, barely existed for most people. A pile of straw or a stiff cloth sack was all that separated bone from floor. Those fortunate enough to sleep near the hearth would wake warmer, but even they stirred often through the night, breath fogging in the cold air. In a world without insulation or luxury, sleep was a patchwork of need and resilience. To rest in the Middle Ages was to endure the night. People didn't sleep in bedrooms, they slept in the same space where they worked, ate, and raised their children. Sleep wasn't an escape from the world, it was deeply embedded in the world's harshness, its smells, sounds, and struggles. The crackle of coals, the creaking of wood, and the shuffling of animals in the dark weren't interruptions. They were the night itself, ever present, inescapable. And yet, through that discomfort, people slept. Not because it was peaceful, but because the body demanded it. Because when the labor of the day was done and the fire had faded to red, rest was the only armor they had left against the cold. Unlike today's long, uninterrupted nights, medieval, sleep followed a rhythm shaped by nature's darkness and the human body's instincts. Across towns and villages, from the humble farmsteads of Northumbria to the forested hamlets of the Rhineland, people didn't sleep through the night. They slept in two distinct phases. The first sleep would begin shortly after sundown. As chores ended and the fire dimmed, families settled down into their makeshift bedding. Children curled beside their parents, elders closest to the warmth. This initial rest was deep and dream-heavy, lasting roughly 4 hours. But then, like clockwork, came the waking hour. Somewhere between midnight and 2 o'clock, men and women would stir. Not from noise or disturbance, but as part of a natural pattern passed down through generations. This wakeful period wasn't seen as strange or unwelcome. It was called the watch, or vigil. During this time, people moved through the shadows of their homes with quiet purpose. Some rekindled the fire or added another log. Others took the opportunity to mend clothes by candlelight or prepare tools for the next day's labor. Husbands and wives whispered to one another, sometimes finding intimacy in the hush of the night, when the world felt paused. Grandmothers might kneel and pray, farmers might step outside to check on their animals, guided only by starlight and instinct. In Old English and French texts, this midnight hour was described as the hour of the soul. It was believed that during the space between the first and second sleep, the boundary between heaven and earth grew thinner, a time when one's thoughts were clearest, when prayers reached God more easily. Then, after an hour or two of this calm wakefulness, people returned to their beds, if they had one, for their second sleep, which lasted until dawn. The crow of a rooster or the stirring of cattle signaled that it was time to rise, dress in the same clothes worn the day before, and meet the cold once again. Modern science has only recently confirmed what medieval life already knew. In the absence of artificial light, the human body naturally leans toward biphasic sleep. What was once seen as a relic of pre-modern life is now understood as something deeply biological, a rhythm lost to gaslights and alarm clocks. In the dim silence of their unheated homes, medieval families didn't just sleep. They followed a cycle older than any calendar, a rhythm of light and dark, breath and stillness, broken by the simple rituals of living in tune with the night. In the heart of the medieval night, after the first sleep had passed, people awoke not with dread, but with quiet familiarity. The midnight vigil, as it was known, was not just tolerated. It was woven into the fabric of daily life. In cottages and chambers across Europe, these hours were filled with subdued activity. The hearth, still glowing faintly, became the center of attention. A father might gently stoke the embers, coaxing a bit more warmth from the coals. A mother might rock a restless infant or wrap another layer around a sleeping child. Some used this time for solitary reflection. They sat still, eyes fixed on the fire, thinking of the day past or the one to come. Others whispered quiet prayers or murmured verses memorized long ago. In towns and hamlets alike, it was widely believed that God walked closest to the earth between the two sleeps, that prayers spoken then traveled farther, were heard more clearly. The vigil was also a time of practical labor. A shepherd might mend a torn tunic. A wife could patch her husband's cloak or prepare the morning's meal. A farmer might sharpen his blade by candlelight. These tasks, small and personal, required little space or noise, perfect for the darkened hush of the night. Neighbors, too, might pay quiet visits. It wasn't unusual for a man to step next door with a loaf of bread to trade or a woman to ask for help with a threadbare garment. The line between sleep and wakefulness blurred during these hours, and with it, the sense of rigid time disappeared. For some couples, the vigil became a moment of closeness, a time to speak without the interruptions of children or chores. Love, after all, had to find its space somewhere in a world ruled by hard labor and crowded living. Writers from medieval France, England, and Italy often referred to this time as the soul's hour, a sacred pause between the two halves of the night. It was not wasted time. It was intentional. People didn't just wait to sleep again. They lived within that hour. And when the vigil drew to an end, sometimes gently, sometimes with a yawn or shiver, people returned to their straw beds or woolen sacks for the second sleep. It was lighter than the first, but no less essential. Dawn would arrive soon, and with it, the weight of a new day. In medieval villages, most people did not sleep in bedrooms because bedrooms didn't exist. The idea of a separate private space for sleep was a luxury reserved for lords, not laborers. For the average peasant family, the hearth room was everything: kitchen, workshop, dining space, nursery, and yes, bedroom. At night, this single room transformed. Wooden benches were cleared of tools and bowls. The earth floor, hardened by years of footsteps, became a shared sleeping ground. Those with a bit of means might lay down on coarse sacks filled with hay or straw. Others used only cloaks, old cloths, or bare boards. Many simply curled up on the dirt in the clothes they'd worn all day. The warmest spot, near the hearth, was reserved for the frailest, the sick, the elderly, and the very young. Families arranged themselves around them in tight clusters, arms and legs overlapping. This wasn't done out of affection alone. It was survival. Human warmth was one of the only defenses against the freezing air that seeped in through the gaps in the wooden walls. And they weren't alone. Animals often slept indoors, sharing space and warmth. Chickens clucked softly in corners. Goats and pigs huddled beside sleeping children. Their body heat added to the warmth of the room, and their presence was not only tolerated, but welcomed. In the harshest winters, a single cow's breath might mean the difference between waking and not. Clothes were not removed. They served as an extra layer of insulation. Shoes were sometimes loosened, but rarely taken off completely, especially if the ground was wet or icy. Sleeping wasn't a time to relax. It was a time to protect oneself. The room remained noisy. Crackling fire, snoring bodies, whispering voices, the rustle of animals. But silence was never expected. Sleep was not private. It was communal. Like the day's labor, the night's rest belonged to everyone. In those cold, crowded huts, the concept of comfort was redefined. There were no mattresses, no clean sheets, no fluff. But there was closeness. There was shared warmth, both literal and emotional, a family wrapped in the only blanket they could rely on, each other. In the medieval countryside, privacy was a dream more distant than comfort. When the sun fell and the fires dimmed, the family home, often a single square room, became a shared cocoon of bodies. There were no doors to separate parent from child, no chambers for the newlywed, No sanctuary for the individual. Everyone slept together, pressed shoulder to shoulder, side by side on the floor or against the wall, forming a human barrier against the cold. Fathers lay beside sons, mothers wrapped themselves around their infants, and elders occupied the best place, nearest the fire. Children's feet stretched toward the embers, wrapped in sackcloth or their father's weather-worn coat still damp from labor in the fields. Even in wealthier homes, true privacy was rare. A hanging cloth might separate one space from another, but that was the extent of solitude. Servants, wet nurses, tutors, and children often shared the same sleeping chamber, if not the same bed. In castles, rows of men-at-arms slept like soldiers on benches, boots still on, swords nearby. In this world, personal space didn't exist, not because it was disrespected, but because the idea itself hadn't been invented. Sleep wasn't an individual act. It was part of daily survival, no different from harvesting crops or cooking meals. The warmth of another body, the rustle of shared blankets, the scent of straw and sweat, these were the nightly constants of medieval life. Newlyweds had no honeymoon suite. In their first nights of marriage, they often lay beneath a tattered cloth curtain alongside the rest of the family. Modesty was upheld not with walls, but with silent rules and careful glances. Animals, too, remained part of this sacred circle. Goats bleated softly nearby. A chicken might roost above the hearth. Sometimes even a pig or calf curled into a straw-lined hollow near the children. Their breath and body heat mattered as much as any blanket. This was not intimacy in the modern sense. It was necessity. The warmth of the group was stronger than any single fire. To sleep alone was to risk freezing. And so people slept together, not in luxury, but in layered closeness, sharing not only heat, but life itself. In such proximity, every movement mattered. One learned the placement of limbs, the rhythm of a child's breath, the fragile ache in a grandmother's back. This was a literacy of the body, of how not to disturb, how to give space without having it. And when the last ember settled into ash, and the breath of the room grew still, the night became one long murmur, a dream shared by many, heard in whispers, snores, and the rustle of straw beneath the weight of survival. Though the nobility lived behind stone walls and beneath painted ceilings, even their sleep was far from solitary. Privacy, a concept we often associate with wealth, was still not fully formed, even among the highborn. In castles and manors, beds were grand but rarely private, and sleep remained a shared experience. In noble households, the master and mistress often slept in a large canopied bed, not in solitude, but with children nearby and servants or attendants sleeping at their feet or in the same room. A governess, a wet nurse, or a trusted maid might have her own mat beside the hearth, while infants shared the bedding with their mothers. Screens or heavy curtains gave only the illusion of separation, not true seclusion. In the women's quarters of noble families, multiple generations sometimes slept side by side, sisters, aunts, handmaidens, each assigned a place not by preference but by necessity. Among knights and men-at-arms, the sleeping quarters resembled military barracks, with benches or low wooden frames set in rows. Bodies lay close, swords within reach, boots never fully removed. In the monasteries, where discipline was sacred and rules governed even the most private habits, sleep was treated as a form of submission. Monks slept fully clothed on wooden platforms or narrow beds, heads shaved, hands folded. During cold seasons, they were allowed to keep on their sandals and cloaks, not out of comfort, but out of mercy. Even in silence, they were never alone. Fellow brothers stirred and shifted nearby, whispering prayers or coughing in the dark. Despite this closeness, boundaries were respected through ritual. Religious fasts forbade married couples from touching during holy seasons, even if they lay inches apart. In the 13th century, church law reminded husbands that carnal contact during Lent or Advent was considered sin, even under the same blanket. Still, necessity often overruled doctrine. Beds were shared not out of desire, but because space, heat, and protection demanded it. Even a mother might sleep beside her grown son, or a brother alongside his sister, separated by nothing more than a threadbare cloth. The medieval world did not conflate bodily closeness with scandal. The morality of the time focused on intent and ritual, not proximity. A crowded sleeping space did not raise eyebrows. It was simply how people endured the night. Animals, too, were not absent from these finer halls. In the corners of storerooms or beneath floorboards, cats, dogs, or even calves nestled in straw-lined hollows. Their warmth was a welcome addition, and their presence familiar. In noble homes and sacred spaces alike, the night belonged not to solitude, but to shared breath and dim candlelight, to whispered prayers and the rustle of wool. Sleep, whether atop feather-stuffed mattresses or hard wooden boards, remained what it had always been, a communal pause in a relentless world. In the peasant homes scattered across the windswept fields of medieval Europe, a bed was not a single piece of furniture. It was an invention assembled nightly, from whatever could keep the cold at bay and the bones off the earth. There were no springs or frames for most. The floor, often packed dirt or stone, was the base upon which sleep was built. The most common foundation was straw, gathered from the field and stuffed into sacks made of linen or coarse canvas. This straw was rarely fresh. It was used for weeks, sometimes months, until it turned brittle, flat, and filled with crumbs, dust, and insects. But still, it was better than the cold ground. Those who could afford it placed sheepskins or coarse wool blankets over the straw, not for luxury, but for practicality. The thick hides not only provided warmth but also gave off a pungent smell that helped drive off fleas and lice. Wool, sweat, smoke, and earth. These were the scents of medieval sleep. In some regions, particularly in the warmer months, peasants used dried moss, hay, or even rags bundled together to create a kind of bedding. In the Slavic lands and northern forests, mothers layered the floor with homemade quilts stitched from hemp, soot-streaked wool, and whatever scraps they had saved. These layers absorbed the body's heat and clung to it tightly through the long night. Sometimes families built a raised wooden platform, called a bedstead or top chan, to escape the dampness rising from the earth. Logs were set beneath the floor to lift a small section near the stove, where warmth lasted longer. On top they laid old cloaks, tattered cushions, and twisted ropes of wool for back support. It was rough and simple, and remarkably effective. In southern Europe, where winters were less cruel, stone slabs covered in sheep hides or mats were enough. In the frozen north, people dug recesses into the thick walls of their homes, creating sleeping nooks that trapped the day's heat like an oven. Children were sometimes tucked into suspended cradles, fashioned from burlap and hung from beams to keep them safe from rodents below. And yet, in most peasant homes, the bed was not a single item. It was a ritual of assembly, performed at the end of each day. Housewives knew which plants, chamomile, wormwood, or St. John's wort, to mix into the hay to ward off insects and ease sleep. They sewed the bags, gathered the stuffing, and cared for the bedding with the wisdom passed down through generations. It may not have been soft, it was rarely clean, but it worked. The body, hardened by labor and weather, didn't long for comfort, it longed only for rest. And after a day of toil, even a pile of straw beneath a patched wool cloak was enough to carry a family through the night. In the cold embrace of winter, when the wind howled through cracks in the timber walls and frost clung to the floor by dawn, a blanket wasn't just a comfort, it was a shield. But in medieval times, true blankets, as we know them today, were a rarity. Most people wrapped themselves in whatever they could salvage, stitch, or inherit. The most common coverings were old woolen capes, threadbare cloaks, or coarse linen sheets passed down from previous generations. A single garment might serve as a traveling coat by day and a blanket by night. Thin cloth was folded over and over, layered across the chest, shoulders, and legs in an effort to trap even a flicker of heat. Poor families often made do with grain sacks turned inside out, stuffed with straw or rags. Some homes had no individual coverings at all. Instead, the entire family would slide under one large patched sheet, huddled so tightly that body heat became the most reliable source of warmth. There was creativity in poverty. Mothers gathered scraps of old clothing, torn skirts, worn shirts, the remnants of baby clothes, and stitched them into patchwork quilts where every square carried a memory of labor, loss, or love. These memory blankets were not just practical. They were a family's past laid over their sleeping bodies. Among those lucky enough to possess handmade sheepskin throws, the warmth was real, but came with weight and a thick, oily scent. In the far north, goat, bear, or wolf skins were prized. Heavy, warm, and insect-repelling, but often greasy and stiff. They weren't cuddly. They were survival tools, dragged over shoulders and backs like armor. In the deepest winters, some households resorted to using straw mats not underneath them, but on top, creating an extra insulating layer. Others fashioned long tubes of cloth, filled with hay or wool, and placed them along the sides of the body to stop warmth from leaking out. In the wealthier homes or monasteries, thick woven woolen sheets, dyed in deep colors like burgundy or midnight blue, were favored. These were traded from weavers or gifted by nobles, and they held heat longer while hiding the dirt better. But for most, luxury was out of reach. Monks often slept in their robes, and peasants wore every piece of clothing they owned to bed, stacking layers of tunics, trousers, cloaks, and even boots to keep from freezing. Families believed that any living creature could help retain warmth. It wasn't uncommon for a goat, dog, or even a few puppies to be brought under the blanket. Children were tucked in tightly between adults, wrapped head to toe like little cocoons to protect their ears and cheeks from the bite of frost. Folk wisdom said that if you shared your sleeping space, the winter wouldn't take you. And so people did, not out of affection alone, but out of necessity, because warmth was life. They built compartments from hanging fabrics to trap body heat. Those with means hung canopies or curtains over beds, turning them into crude insulators. Even kings, as painted in ancient manuscripts, slept under multiple layers of fur and cloth, proof that not even crowns could keep out the cold. Blankets weren't measured by their softness. They were measured by how well they fought off the night. Whether made of linen, hide, or memory, they were the silent warriors of the dark, pulled up tight to the chin, hiding the fear of freezing beneath the weight of love, effort, and endurance. Before the invention of bed warmers, heated bricks, or central fires that reached every room, medieval families turned to one of the Earth's oldest allies to fend off the winter chill: stone. Long before sleep, before the children were tucked in and the door was fastened against the wind, a flat stone or old brick was placed deep in the flames of the hearth. It would glow, crackle, and absorb the fire's heat like a silent sponge. Then, wrapped carefully in layers of cloth, burlap, or old fur, it was carried, like a treasure, to the bed. This stone, warm to the core, became the first thing to meet the straw, wood, or sackcloth of the makeshift bed. It was placed at the feet, under the chest, or in the center of the sleeping space. In the deep north, in the hills of Scotland, the valleys of Scandinavia, or the damp huts of Eastern Europe, these stones were more than warmers. They were survival tools. Whole families had rituals around these stones. Children got smaller. One's women were given two, one for the chest and one for the feet. Peasants reused old bricks from broken stoves or river stones, smooth and round from years of erosion, that heated quickly and released their warmth slowly into the night air. In some homes, larger stones were placed in clay pots and set near the bed like primitive space heaters. Others pressed them directly to the belly or between their thighs, warming the body's core before the long descent into sleep. The stone did more than heat. In homes with damp, earthen floors and thin walls, it also fought moisture, driving out the wetness that crept upward from the ground. If the bedding was cold or soaked from a leak, a heated stone helped dry it, or at least take the edge off. This tradition wasn't just limited to peasants. In monasteries and castles, metal boxes filled with coals, the early version of bed warmers, took the place of stones. But in the common home, stone remained king. It required no metal, no chimney, no wealth, only fire and patience. Some mothers kept hot stones wrapped and set them in their laps while spinning or sewing. Soldiers took them on campaigns, warming their hands during halts and sleeping with them under cloaks in frozen tents. In the bitterest winters of the 100 Years' War, soldiers of House d'Argent and House Braithwaite were recorded as carrying smooth stones in their packs, chosen not for weaponry, but for warmth. In the Slavic East, heated stones were used, for medicinal purposes too. They were applied to aching joints, chests gripped by coughs, or cold swollen feet. In some regions, the stones were given names, passed down from generation to generation, each carrying the soot of winters long. Past stone wasn't just warm. It was memory, a keeper of fire, a thing that survived the day to fight the night. As snow blanketed the world and winds tore at the thatch above, the glow of the hearth faded, but beneath an old hide or under the hem of a patched wool skirt, the stone still pulsed with heat. It was a companion, a quiet, heavy promise that even the bitterest cold could be outlasted. In the medieval night, undressing for bed was a luxury few could afford, and many wouldn't dare. The cold was an adversary that crept in from every crack in the wall, every breath of wind beneath the door. To take off clothing before sleep was to invite danger. So people slept in what they wore, and often in what they'd worn for days. Peasants lay down in woolen tunics, coarse trousers, and even boots, not out of laziness, but from sheer necessity. The floors, whether hardened clay or rough-hewn planks, retained the chill long after the fires died down. If you stripped down for the night, you risked waking with a cough, or worse, an illness that could mean death. Even in noble households with grand hearths and thick curtains, warmth was patchy and precious. Not every chamber could be heated. Servants slept in hallways or beside doors. Children curled under layers of capes and sackcloth, still in their day clothes, heads wrapped in shawls or tucked into cloaks. In some homes, boots were loosened but rarely removed. They shielded the feet from the cold floor during midnight awakenings, whether to check on livestock, fetch water, or calm a crying child. In winter, every second spent barefoot could leach the warmth from a body already trembling. Clothing wasn't just a garment. It was a barrier, a second skin layered not for appearance, but for defense. A farmer might wear 2 or 3 shirts at once. A mother would wrap herself in every shawl she owned to protect the infant she held. Little ones were tucked into woolen sleeves or wrapped in cloaks damp from work, still stained with the day's labor. In the army and in times of war or raids, it became even more critical. Soldiers were ordered to sleep in their boots and coats, weapons nearby, always ready for alarm. To be caught undressed in the night was to risk your life. Even monks, bound by vows of humility and moderation, rarely removed their robes. In winter, in the icy monasteries of the north, friars huddled on wooden boards in full dress, sandals laced tight, fingers pulled into their sleeves for warmth. Historian Brother Theodoric of Elmwood once wrote that the cell was colder than the field, and we slept as if already buried. The concept of nightclothes or pajamas simply didn't exist for most people. If a peasant had more than one shirt, it was a miracle. A clean change of clothes often meant putting on the least soiled garment. Washing was dangerous in winter. Water froze, illness followed. Bathing was rare and sometimes feared, so they stayed in their clothes, not out of ignorance but out of ancient hard-earned wisdom. Mothers taught their daughters which garments held heat best. Fathers told their sons to keep their boots near the head in case they needed to run. Children were told stories of neighbors who froze in their sleep, not for lack of shelter, but for thinking one layer was enough. By morning, the clothes were stiff with cold, but they were still there, a shield wrapped in memory, sweat, and survival. To sleep dressed was not a wild practice. It was a centuries-old survival tactic, passed from mouth to ear, from parent to child. A way of facing the night armored not in steel, but in layers of cloth, grit, and experience. And when dawn finally broke, with light seeping in through frost-covered shutters, most would rise, still wrapped in the same warmth they had worked and slept in, ready to face another day. For medieval families, the night was not a time of peace. It was a time of vigilance. Beneath the layers of wool, under the weight of hides and cloaks, another kind of danger stirred. small, biting, crawling threats that no lock or prayer could hold back. Bedbugs lived in the seams of straw sacks and crevices of wooden planks. Fleas and lice infested blankets, tunics, even hair. In the darkness, rats rustled along the walls or scratched at the hearth for crumbs. There was no true escape. Sleep itself became a battlefield where the enemy was silent, invisible, and always hungry. No peasant believed their home was truly clean, not because they didn't care, but because they couldn't afford the fantasy. Cold, moisture, dirt, and rot were everywhere, and so were the creatures that thrived in them. Bedding was shaken out not just to fluff it, but to release the insects, to let the straw breathe before it was laid down again. Monastery scrolls and village journals speak of fumigations using wormwood, juniper, or burning herbs, and while the scent lifted briefly into the rafters, the reprieve never lasted. Within nights, the scratching, itching, and crawling returned. The wealthy fared little better. Even in castles with feather-stuffed mattresses, servants were ordered to scrape lice and fleas from beds before their lords retired. Yet the pests returned, hiding in drapes, cushions, and wood carvings too ornate to clean, and the dangers didn't end with bites. Sleep was haunted by the threat of disease. In cold seasons, illness spread fast in cramped rooms where everyone breathed the same air. Coughs, rashes, fevers, suffocation in infants. These were not rare, but common. A single sick child could mean a week of agony for the entire household. For those who lived through the great plagues, the night brought a deeper fear, a fear of death by breath, of the unseen, spreading in silence. People left vinegar bowls or bundles of salt by their beds, hoping they might absorb illness. In some places, villagers placed knives under pillows or iron crosses on doorposts, not for burglars, but for protection against evil. Folk wisdom said never to leave an empty jug overnight. Spirits might crawl in, and if a rat was seen near a sleeping child, fear swept through the family like fire. Rats bit. Rats carried death. The spiritual dread was just as heavy. The hours between midnight and 3, the time between the first and second sleep, were believed to be the hours of the devil's reign. This was when nightmares came, when whispers could become suffocation, when people woke with bruises or claw marks and blamed it not on splinters, but demons. What we now call sleep paralysis was then believed to be a witch pressing on the chest, or the spirit of the dead seeking warmth. Some cried out in the night, unable to move, their bodies locked in fear, their voices hoarse from prayers half-whispered in the dark. Children were told never to look out the window after sunset. If an owl was perched there, it was an omen. If the wind howled, it was not wind, it was the voices of the dead. Entire villages assigned night watchmen to pace through hamlets, whispering blessings and carrying sacred tokens, not just to deter thieves, but to guard against the invisible. And so people lay down each night, not into peace, but into fragile stillness, hoping the rats would stay away, the air would stay clean, and the darkness would stay empty. Sleep was never total. It was broken, light, strained, a half-rest under siege. In that tension, people waited for the light, not to rise refreshed, but to know they had survived. In times of war, plague, or famine, sleep was not only scarce, it became a luxury few could afford. The body still yearned for it, but the world had no time for softness. Across battlefields, in ruined villages, and behind the crumbling walls of castles under siege, rest was stolen in slivers, if it came at all. For soldiers called to arms, sleep meant armor still on, sword close, back against stone. They dozed in seated positions, upright against trees or walls, heads bowed from exhaustion, but minds alert. Every noise could be the enemy. Every footstep a signal that death approached. Chronicles from the campaigns of Lord Kendrick of Ainsley and the hill sieges of the northern barons speak of warriors collapsing onto frozen ground, trying to catch a breath between waves of combat. They often rested for minutes, not hours. Eyelids fluttering shut in darkness, lit only by the fading flame of a torch, surrounded by groans of the wounded and the whisper of wind through broken rafters. Hunger hollowed out the spirit. An empty stomach made sleep shallow, the ache too loud to silence. Pain kept people awake. Sores opened from cold, skin cracked, muscles stiffened. Some didn't wake at all. Villagers whose homes had burned in raids slept in fields, in half-collapsed barns beneath makeshift tents patched from cloaks and grain sacks. There was no straw, no stone, no fire, only hope and the will to live another day. In those desperate moments, some turned to bundles of herbs, lavender, chamomile, dried rose petals, tucked into pouches and placed near the nose to coax the mind into dreaming, if only for an hour. A brief escape, a breath of peace. Mothers, widows, and elders tried to give the youngest a few moments of shelter, forming circles around them in caves, in chapels, in forest clearings, shielding them with their own bodies, like walls of flesh and warmth. Children slept better, even in disaster. They were lighter, less aware. But the adults? They stayed half awake, half guarding, half praying. Monks knelt in burned-out sanctuaries and recited evening prayers by memory, their robes torn, hands blistered from burying the dead. Still, they gave thanks if they lived to close their eyes again. Military records from the late 15th century speak of men who slept with eyes open, their bodies simply giving out from fatigue. They awoke at the snap of a twig, the echo of a cough, minds trained to hear the danger before it arrived. During famine, when even rats were scarce, the body didn't rest so much as collapse. With nothing left to burn for heat, people wrapped themselves in ashes, in dust, in the memory of warmer seasons. They lay down not to dream, but because standing any longer was no longer possible. And yet, through all of this, through war, starvation, pestilence, and fear, people fought for their moments of sleep, not for comfort, but for survival. A few hours of shut eyes could be the difference between a mind breaking and a mind enduring. Medieval sleep, in its rawest form, wasn't about beds or blankets. It was a symbol of resilience, of closing one's eyes despite the gnawing cold, the rat's scratch, the echo of battle, or the weight of grief. To sleep in those centuries was an act of faith, a way of telling the darkness, "I will wake again."